It really is an honor to be introduced by Bernd Greiner, whose work is extremely well known in very serious communities in the U.S. of people that are interested in the role that 9/11 has played in changing not only U.S. politics and U.S. policies, but also the world. And Bernd wrote an incredibly powerful book about the Vietnam War, where he and I have been discussing this. He basically went and discovered a hidden archive of U.S. war crimes and dug through reams of paper in a basement in the United States and brought to light issues and facts about the role of paramilitary-style U.S. forces in Vietnam that had never before been published. So it's really, it's an honor to be with him and an honor to be here at the Einstein Forum, and thank you, Susan, very much for inviting me. I have to say at the onset, because I'm in a room with a lot of distinguished people, that I'm not a very distinguished person at all. I don't have a college degree. I dropped out of university. I've never taken a journalism course in my life. If I had to put together a CV, I don't know that I would be able to do it in terms of the sort of academic credentials that the academy would want you to have in order to give you a piece of paper that gives you permission to be a journalist. I basically was someone who learned journalism as a trade, the way that you would learn to be a plumber or an electrician or a carpenter. I won't go into great detail about this, but the short of the story is that I wanted to be a school teacher, but then I went to university and discovered that I was a terrible student, and so that wasn't going to work out for me. And it wasn't that I was like out partying every night at the university, it's just that I didn't like what was going on in the classroom. And so I started my own sort of course of studies and reading, and I got very involved with some political struggles on the campus of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I was technically enrolled as a student but not attending classes, and basically came to a point of view where I thought my professors were full of shit, and were preaching this social justice gospel for their students to follow. But then when it came to defending the rights of homeless people on the campus, or confronting the role that big corporations played on the campus in fueling the war machine, that they were too timid or afraid to speak up, and I didn't really want anything to do with them. So I hitchhiked from Wisconsin, which is in the middle of the US near Canada, out to Washington, D.C., and I moved into the nation's largest homeless shelter, which is just 2 blocks away from the Capitol. And I started listening to a lot of talk radio there, because much of what I was doing was taking old guys, many of whom were veterans of the Korean War, the Vietnam War, to the Veterans Administration to try to fill out their paperwork, or taking them to doctor's appointments. And I heard this woman on the radio named Amy Goodman, who hosts a show that's called Democracy Now!, which actually is quite popular in Germany, I've discovered. Has a global audience. And she was doing these incredible reports about rebels in the Congo fighting to overthrow the US-backed dictatorship of Mobutu Sese Seko, and she was covering the very right-wing Congress that had been elected in what was called the Republican Revolution, or the contract with America, that brought to power this reprehensible, vicious little man named Newt Gingrich, who implemented an agenda that was just blatantly anti-poor, anti-women, anti-working class. And I heard this woman, and I thought she must have an army of people that work with her, because she was doing these reports from all over the world. And so at that time, I didn't have a computer, much less a mobile phone. So for the younger people in the audience, we used to have these things called pens and paper. And I wrote her what was called a letter. It's sort of like an email, except you should take care on your spelling and not use terms like LOL or BRB or YOLO, which is my favorite. You only live once. And I started writing her letters and saying, if you have a dog, I'll walk your dog. If you have a cat, I'll feed your cat. I wash windows. I just want to do anything I can to be a part of what you do. And I don't have any experience whatsoever, except I promised I would work very hard. And eventually I started stalking her. Not in a creepy, I want to go on a date with you kind of way that I'm sure all women just love when men do that, but in like a can I do anything for you kind of way, like get you coffee or whatever. And I think she hit a point, and she and I now are extremely close and very good friends, and she was my mentor, where she had to decide whether she was going to let me volunteer for her, or if she was going to call the police and get a restraining order against me. And she invited me to eventually, or I forced my way in, depending on how you look at it, let me come in and start volunteering for her. And as I told you, I thought she had like 30 people working for her. It was just her and one other person in a broom closet in this radio station in New York, which was reeked of marijuana. There were people sleeping in the hallways of this place. And here is this incredible journalist, Amy Goodman, stuck in a broom closet with a dot matrix printer. For young people, they would go, and sort of, eventually your document would kind of print, and like an Atom 7, computer, and that was Democracy Now! At the time. And I learned journalism by studying under Amy, who was this incredible journalist. She'd covered the Intifada, the first Intifada. She was almost killed in East Timor. In 1992, she survived the Dili massacre, where US-backed Indonesian forces had gunned down more than 250 Timorese with their US-manufactured weapons, and then proceeded to beat her and another US journalist who had witnessed the mass slaughter. And she built up what I think is the finest independent media institution in the United States. And so I started working for her, and she gave me an opportunity to start doing a little bit of international travel, helping her. And we went to Nigeria. I eventually went to Iraq. And I went to Iraq in the 1990s at a time when there was a kind of undeclared war, economic war there, where the United States and its allies had imposed the most extensive regime of economic sanctions in history under the auspices of the United Nations. And they had these lists of items that Iraq was not allowed to import that included lead pencils because of a potential military value, which is ridiculous, basic bleach, analgesics. And I went there for the first time in the late 1990s with a humanitarian delegation that traveled to Iraq to symbolically break those sanctions by bringing in goods that were on this so-called dual-use list. And I remember traveling around the hospitals of Iraq, and it was like entering a death row for infants, where you had incredible rise in birth defects, largely caused by the munitions used on both sides of the Gulf War by the Iraqi forces and by the US and British forces using depleted uranium munitions and other chemical-style weapons as they targeted the infrastructure of Iraq. And you would have doctors. Iraq was a fairly modern, very secular society. And you had doctors that were trained in Western Europe and the United States who would say to us, while standing above patients, the only difference between me and my patients is that I have a white jacket on and I know how I could treat them, but I don't have the means to actually treat them. They were reusing syringes many, many times over. They didn't have cleaning supplies, so they were using petrol to clean the floors of the hospitals. And then you had these children that were being born with birth defects that didn't exist in modern medical journals at the time. And I didn't know really what I was doing as a reporter, and so I started. And I think part of the problem with the way that journalism is taught at the university is that you're actually taught that there are certain rules of how you're supposed to view the world. And if you're not tainted by someone else's vision of what it means to tell a story or to tell the truth, you're less likely to become cynical quickly. And I think what happened is that I just started from a position of I don't understand all of the geopolitics here, but I understand who the people are in front of me, and I'm going to try to tell their stories. And so for the first decade or so of work that I did as a journalist, a lot of what I was doing was simply going and interviewing people in countries around the world who lived on the other side of the barrel of the gun of the American war machine, or who were in some way or another being targeted economically by Western powers or militarily by Western powers. And that led me to spending a lot of time in Iraq. And I learned conflict reporting sort of in a baptism by fire. And I worked at Democracy Now! For many years, and I still consider it sort of my home. Because I don't have a degree, I list it as my university on like my social media stuff. And I'm very proud of that university. In 2005, I decided to leave Democracy Now! And I took a fellowship at the Nation Institute, which is a nonprofit organization attached to the Nation magazine, which is the oldest continuously published weekly magazine in the US. It's a relatively small liberal publication. And fellowship, as Bernd knows, at least in the US context, is code for a very little bit of money to do a lot of work. And so I took a gig there for $25,000 a year with no health benefits. And that's before taxes, so I was making roughly a few $100s a month. But I loved every second of it because someone was actually giving me some money to write, which was unusual for me at that point in my life. And the first story that I did was to go to the U.S. city of New Orleans in the aftermath of the flooding of the city caused by Hurricane Katrina. And when I arrived there, it reminded me of being in Afghanistan or Yugoslavia or Iraq. It did look, in fact, like a war zone. And there was almost no response from the Bush administration initially to this horrid disaster. You would see ordinary people riding around in boats in what was a few weeks earlier their neighborhood, where they would have been driving their cars, and they were rescuing people and rescuing pets. And on one level, it was a remarkable, moving story of ordinary people helping each other. On another level, it was this shocking moment where the state had completely abandoned a population. The National Guard of the state of Louisiana, which would have been the first responder to this crisis and would have been able to have the capability of setting up large-scale disaster response, was deployed in Iraq as part of Bush's wars. I remember being at the airfield when the National Guard of Louisiana started coming back, when Bush actually allowed them to go back and help in their community, to do the jobs that they enlisted in the National Guard to do. They didn't enlist in the National Guard to fight in Iraq. They enlisted to respond to disasters and emergencies in their own state. It's not that Bush was doing something illegal by sending them, it's that he sent almost all of them there, and none of them were there when they were actually needed to do their primary function. And some of these soldiers, and this is illegal in the US military, some of these soldiers were getting off that plane and saying openly to journalists, "Fuck George Bush." And I remember just seeing the look on the faces of some of these young soldiers whose families had drowned, basically. Their entire livelihood was gone, and they're over in Iraq. And so you had this moment where there was just this shocking contrast in American society, where African Americans who were breaking into grocery stores or corner delis to try to get food or diapers during this period were being portrayed as looters and criminals. I would see electronic stores with flat screen televisions and stereo equipment untouched next to a little deli that had been totally stripped clean because you can't eat a stereo. And yet the image you were getting around the world, or at least as it was being projected by US media, was that these savages are using the crisis to loot. And in the midst of this, I'm traveling around the French Quarter in New Orleans, and I come across some New York City police officers who were standing on a corner, and there were firefighters and police from all over the United States that came down to volunteer because they realized no one else was doing it. And being from New York, and 9/11 was coming up, I was talking to the officers, and they were telling me, we're going to do a little 9/11 memorial at this camp where we're staying, and we were just sort of making small talk. One of the guys was from Brooklyn, and we're standing there talking, and this small car pulls up next to us, and these massive men get out of the car, and it was, I don't know if you have this concept here, but it was like a clown car, where just an endless stream of men seemed to pour out of this tiny car. And they're wearing these sort of paramilitary gear, these khaki outfits with bulletproof vests, and they had M4 assault rifles and Glock 9 pistols strapped to their legs, and they had these horribly gaudy wraparound sunglasses, and they had this bear paw logo on their hats, like of a bear's paw with a sniper scope around it. And they come up to us and sort of, with all their gear, and they say to the police officers, "Where are the rest of the Blackwater guys?" And I had sort of one of those moments where my head started sort of spinning around, and I'm thinking what the fuck, Blackwater? This is America. And so they're talking to the police officers, and they get back into their mercenary clown car, and they whiz away. And I said to the police officers, "Blackwater, you mean like the guys in Iraq and Afghanistan?" And they said, "Yeah, they're all over the place down here." It's like there was no response from anyone, and Blackwater is somehow there. Bush is golfing and flying around and talking about rare horse breeds with the guy who's supposed to be responding to the disaster for the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and talking about how his government's doing a heck of a job, and there's no one there doing any job, no much less a heck of a job, but there's Blackwater mercenaries there. So, I walk down the street and find these Blackwater guys, and they are throwing furniture off of a balcony above a bar out of an apartment, and they drape this American flag there, and then they also put a flag of their bear paw logo, and they were setting up shop in someone's apartment in the French Quarter. And I went up to them and started talking to these guys, and I had been in Iraq, so we were talking about some of the geography. Where have you been? Camp so-and-so, camp such and such. We're sort of chatting, and I said, what are you guys doing down here? And security. I said, well, what do you mean security? They're like, well, we're here to confront criminals, stop looters. And I said, well, under whose auspices? And at first, they said, well, the owner of our company, Eric Prince, sent us here. And it's true, for the first week that they were there, they had no contract with any entity. One American citizen decided he was going to deploy paramilitaries onto the streets of an American city to confront criminals and stop looters. And looters was being defined in the US press at the time as black people trying to get food or diapers out of stores. So to me, it sounded like we're down here to kill black people for taking food because they've been abandoned by the government. I mean, that's when you reduce it down to what the message was. So eventually, one of them whips out a gold badge from underneath his vest and says that he's been deputized by the governor of the state of Louisiana. This phrase from the Wild West, he's been deputized. And we start talking, and one of them says, I hear him on his phone saying to someone else on the other end, oh, no, you don't want to work for Blackwater here. We're only getting $350 a day, $350 a day. So I start investigating this thing, the confront criminals, stop looters. I start calling the Department of Homeland Security in the US and saying, look, there's these Blackwater guys down here. They're saying that they're deputized. Some of them are saying they're here to confront criminals. Ultimately, they told me that they're working for the Department of Homeland Security. And at first, the Department of Homeland Security denied this, and they said to me, no, we don't have any record of Blackwater being hired. So as a journalist, I'm thinking, this is scandalous. You've got these paramilitaries on the streets of an American city openly saying that they're there to confront criminals and looters. It's a flagrant violation of U.S. laws to do this. You can't just send an armed force, especially going from one state to another, to go and engage in these kinds of activities. And just as I was about to publish my story, the Department of Homeland Security called me and said, oh, actually, we've found an answer for you. We did hire Blackwater. And what it was is they hired them on what's called a no-bid contract, meaning that they didn't ask other entities to apply for the contract. They just gave them a $70 million contract. And my favorite part of this is that the contract was to protect the emergency responders that Bush never sent. So they didn't say, I don't know if the emergency responders have arrived yet in New Orleans, but Blackwater was there guarding the non-existent emergency response from this US entity called FEMA. So these guys are getting the no-bid contract. The guys are getting paid $350 a day. Blackwater billed US taxpayers, charged US taxpayers $950 per day per man in the hurricane zone. During this time, I also saw Israeli paramilitaries from a company called Instinctive Shooting International, ISI, Instinctive Shooting International, who had flown from Galveston, Texas by helicopter and landed in this park across the street from a large gated wealthy community where private security guards were going to keep the hordes of looters from touching the rich people's cake. And they have snipers on the rooftops, and they have a checkpoint on the streets of an American city. Guys who were in the Israeli special forces and intelligence services, and I interviewed them, are on the streets of an American city with semi-automatic weapons, stopping the cars of American citizens and asking to search their vehicles. It was like Baghdad on the bayou, the bayou, the US Gulf and the Persian Gulf. It was like everything going on in Iraq and Afghanistan with Bush's wars had sort of come home. Paramilitaries, mercenaries, a sort of state of siege where the poor were becoming poorer and more desperate. There were wealthy businessmen from New Orleans, white wealthy businessmen, who were making statements in the financial press in the United States, which is when you see who's really in control. And they were saying things like, this is an opportunity to change the demographics of this city, New Orleans, which has this incredibly rich black cultural history. And if it doesn't change, we're out of here, meaning like we're going to take our money and leave the city. So this sort of vision that was playing out with the neoconservative blueprint in the Persian Gulf was now coming home, and all of these companies, the Halliburtons, the Bechtels, the Blackwaters, start sending their people down there and building up these operations. Then they bring in the neoliberal economic planners, and they start talking about structural adjustment. And so I took one tiny little sliver of this story, the Blackwater issue, and said, like, how is it that this company that is operating as a mercenary force abroad has been hired to do the same thing inside of the United States? And discovered that the owner of the company, the founder and owner of the company, Eric Prince, was a radical right-wing Christian supremacist who was a major supporter of the Republican Revolution and whose family is one of the most important families in the history of fundraising for what's called the radical religious right in the United States. So you have a Christian supremacist character who's operating in Muslim countries, then comes back and gets a no-bid contract to send his forces onto the streets of a US city. And I became obsessed with that company and started writing article after article about them and investigating their structure, what they're doing in Iraq, what they're doing inside the United States, who runs the company, what are the connections to the CIA, what are the connections to the military, what are the connections to the Department of Homeland Security inside the US. And eventually the editor of my magazine, Katrina Vanden Heuvel, and I had just started there, said to me, Jeremy, we really love your work and you're doing great stuff, but we are a small weekly magazine. We can't do an article every week about the same company. Like, you have to either diversify what you do, or write a book, or something. You just can't write about Blackwater every week. So I had I have no money. I had no health insurance at all. And I was absolutely obsessed with this company. So I decided, okay, I'll try to write a book. And at first I thought it was just going to be a collection of like my reports, and we'd change some of the words and put it out so I could get it out of my system. Well, I ended up doing a multi-year investigation into this company and writing a rather large book. And I thought that I was going to be like selling it out of my backpack, traveling around the US. I got paid nothing to write the book. I didn't have an agent. I was just happy that someone said, yes, we'll put this hard thing around your paper and say that it's a book. Like, I was like, wow, this is unbelievable. And by some kind of like freak accident of nature, the book ends up like doing well and ending up on the New York Times bestseller list. And then I end up on, no one had really heard of Blackwater. And then a few months after my book comes out, Blackwater forces gunned down 16 civilians in Baghdad in September of 2007 in what became known as the Nicer Square Massacre. And I had never been on TV before. I had never been interviewed by anyone. I've never been mentioned in a big newspaper. And all of a sudden, I'm on every single TV show talking about this company. And so, my work on that and on Blackwater led me into this other world of the history of paramilitary forces in the US and the CIA's paramilitary division and the military's Joint Special Operations Command, known as JSOC. I want to talk a little bit about those forces and their history, but I want to first briefly tell you a little story about something that happened under President Obama's administration, and then back up from there and come back to it. In September of 2011, Barack Obama was presented with a security briefing on a man that he had identified as his number one priority to hunt down and kill across the world. Osama bin Laden had just been killed in May of 2011, and the top priority was not Ayman al-Zawahiri, bin Laden's successor, but an American citizen named Anwar al-Awlaki. And President Obama and the CIA and the Joint Special Operations Command had been hunting this American citizen for a little over 2 years, when in September of 2011, Obama was presented with a briefing saying that they have a 100% lock on Anwar al-Awlaki's location. And they had found him in the north of Yemen, in this small village called Kashef, which was interesting because he was from the south of Yemen, and the US drone strikes had primarily been hitting in the south. But they found him staying in a small house in a village with about 10 houses total. And they had him under surveillance for a month as President Obama weighed what he wanted to do. Anwar al-Awlaki had not been charged with a crime by the United States related to terrorism. There was not a warrant out for his arrest on terrorism-related charges in the United States. He certainly said things in public that I found reprehensible. He may have been involved with criminal plots, but there was never any indictment against him. Because President Obama, who is a constitutional lawyer by training and won the Nobel Peace Prize, decided that he was going to serve as the prosecutor, the judge, the jury, and potentially the executioner of an American citizen who had not actually been charged with a crime. And on September 30th, 2011, President Obama gave the go-ahead. And US drones and other aircraft penetrated Yemeni airspace. They watched with satellite imagery as Anwar al-Awlaki and 3 other men, one of whom was another American citizen named Samir Khan, who also had not been charged with a crime, got into their vehicles and started to drive. And then the decision was made to take them out. Missiles were fired at the convoy, and a second round of missiles were fired to ensure that the occupants were all killed. And so 4 people were blown up, including 2 American citizens, neither of whom had been charged with any crime. The next day, President Obama was speaking at a military facility in the United States, and he didn't say the United States killed one of its own citizens. He said there's been an operation in Yemen, and we learned that Anwar al-Awlaki has been killed. And he praised the Yemeni government for their involvement in the operation, but never said this is a US operation. And he identified Anwar al-Awlaki as the head of external operations of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, a title that Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula had never once given to Anwar al-Awlaki. And there are questions about what was al-Awlaki's relationship with Al-Qaeda. They're legitimate. I spend hundreds of pages in my book trying to make sense of who Anwar al-Awlaki really was. But here's one fact that's sort of hilarious. When the head of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula sent a letter by courier to Osama bin Laden when he was in Abbottabad, he said, I want to make this guy Anwar al-Awlaki the head of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula because it would be a great propaganda victory against the Americans to have an American citizen be the head of the organization. And bin Laden writes back the equivalent of like an F off to these guys and says, I don't think so. I've never heard of him really. I mean, I know his speeches, but we don't know anything about him. So yeah, thanks, but no thanks. You'll just stay the head of Al-Qaeda. So, it probably was news to Al-Qaeda that Anwar al-Awlaki was this senior operational figure. He was nobody in Yemen. He was only scary to the United States because he was speaking in English. It had the potential to encourage or incite young Muslims in Western countries to engage in attacks. That's a serious issue. Democratic societies have to have a way of addressing that kind of activity. But most societies in the world probably don't believe you fast forward to the death penalty phase of a trial, not to mention that most countries in the world are opposed to the death penalty. But nonetheless, for have Mr. Nobel Peace Prize winner say, well, I'm just going to serve as his executioner now, it's like Alice in Wonderland, where the Queen says verdict first and trial later, except there was no trial. There was just verdict, and that's it. So how did we get to a point where a Democratic president who was elected on a campaign that truly was global in nature, who projected a message to the world that he wanted to radically change the way that his government was going to conduct foreign policy, conduct the business of counterterrorism, who said he was going to roll back and end many of the worst practices of the Bush and Cheney era? How do we get to a point where he's crossing a line and saying, I can just declare that there are American citizens who need to die, even if they're not on an active battlefield, and we've been watching them in this tiny village for a month. I have the right to do that. Well, I would argue that that this is part of a trajectory that in reality began in the aftermath of World War II. When the CIA was created in the 1950s, it was envisioned as a somewhat of a paramilitary organization, but also an organization that would engage in false flag operations, what we call now targeted killing, trying to impact the domestic politics of other nations, trying to enact regime change when necessary, trying to quash popular movements that might affect corporate profits for huge American at first corporations, but ultimately multinational corporations. And one of the first acts of the CIA was to overthrow the democratically elected government of Jacobo Arbenz in 1953 in Guatemala. And that kicked off a series of coups and support for right-wing military juntas, death squads, paramilitary forces, not just in Central and Latin America, but around the world. You had the 1973 overthrow of Salvador Allende's government, and then the United States backing the rise of General Augusto Pinochet. You had the U.S. support for the Contra death squads in Nicaragua, for Battalion 316 in Honduras, for genocidal forces in Guatemala. and El Salvador. And then in Africa, the U.S. was involved in multiple nations in trying to end populist movements or to overthrow governments that rose out of the anti-colonialist struggles in various parts of Africa. And we could keep going eastward and talk about what the United States was doing in China and elsewhere around the world. And this sort of era of coups, of political assassinations, of support for right-wing military juntas, then started to bleed into the Vietnam War. And during the Vietnam War, I mean, Berendt wrote a whole book that you really should check out. There are volumes of scholarship on this, and incredible exposés, and wonderful journalism, and great memoirs of people that were diplomats or soldiers or ordinary people that had something to do with the Vietnam War. So I won't get into the whole history, but I will single out one program in Vietnam, and that was the Phoenix program, which was a joint program of the CIA and what was called the Studies and Observations Group, the SOG, which was essentially a paramilitary force that drew on members of the U.S. Special Operations Forces and U.S. Special Forces. And it was effectively a death squad that had at its center the idea that they would use proxy forces, Vietnamese proxy forces, as a kind of kill squad alongside trained American assassins. And it also involved sabotage and disinformation. And the Phoenix program was the intellectual godfather of what would later become the global targeted killing campaign of first the Bush and Cheney administration and then the Obama administration. After all of these coups, assassinations of the 50s, 60s, 70s, the escalation of the war in Vietnam, Congress finally decided that it wanted to do something about the CIA, and particularly about this issue of assassinations at home and also targeting of activists and journalists inside the United States. And so a senator from the state of Idaho named Frank Church formed a committee that was going to investigate the CIA. At that time, Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney were both beginning in the midst of their political ascent. They were rising political forces. They thought that what the Church Committee did was like the darkest moment in the history of the US Republic, that it was like the worst thing that possibly could have happened to the national security state. The idea that Congress thought that it had any role to play in the conduct of America's foreign policy other than just signing the checks and authorizing the payment for these wars, secret and overt, was disgusting to them. So you have Frank Church investigating, Congress passing a series of laws aimed at reining in the CIA, and then these sort of powerful forces within what would become the Bush-Cheney White House realizing this as like the worst moment in their political lifetime and perhaps in the history of the United States when it came to national security policy. And you would see this sort of battle going on over the next couple of decades leading up to 9/11. Of course, George H.W. Bush, as the former director of the CIA, was all about covert action. And they tried to find ways around various laws that Congress had passed. The Reagan administration began to widely use these signing statements. If Congress passed a law they didn't like, the White House would just issue an executive order saying, yeah, we understand that, but we're going to do this thing anyway. And President Obama does it, and President Bush did it also. But this really was a kind of one of the bedrocks of the philosophy that the movement that would become the neocons built their political ideology around, the idea that there should essentially be a dictatorship in the United States of the executive branch of government when it comes to implementing foreign policy or national security policy around the world. And it goes back to one of the Federalist Papers in U.S. history of the idea of the unitary executive. So you have Cheney and Rumsfeld really embracing this idea of building up the power of the executive branch. Clinton then comes into office, and they viewed him as like an absolute radical pacifist who was intent on destroying America. They didn't know who Barack Obama was yet, the sort of black Marxist, socialist, Manchurian candidate, but they really hated Clinton and viewed him as a radical pacifist. Clinton was, of course, a very hawkish Democrat. He bombed a pharmaceutical plant in the Sudan. He bombed Afghanistan. He regularly bombed Iraq. His bombing in Iraq of the no-fly zones in the north and south represented the longest sustained bombing campaign that the United States had engaged in since Vietnam. This isn't a speech about Clinton, but just to say, when the Republicans characterized Clinton as a pacifist, it was utterly laughable. But Clinton did do something that infuriated them, and that was that he essentially chained some of the most valuable forces in the perspective of Cheney and Rumsfeld available in the US national security arsenal to a fence in the backyard of the White House, and said, you are not going to go anywhere unless I authorize it, and I'm only going to authorize you to go anywhere in very rare circumstances. So this organization, JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command, which was used to operating all throughout Central and Latin America under these Republican administrations, used to operating in Africa and elsewhere around the world with very limited oversight, very limited sense that they were going to be subjected to any real rules or regulations, all of a sudden find themselves being told by President Clinton and his team of liberal lawyers, sorry, you can't do that. When they wanted to kill bin Laden, the Clinton lawyers would say, how many civilians are in the house? What kind of doorknobs is it? You know, is the ceiling made out of tin or is it wood? They would try to find any reason to not authorize it. If you read the Clinton era national security documents on the question of targeted killing, they were primarily debating the targeted killing of one individual, Osama bin Laden. And there were thousands of memos written about this. And US officials saying in blunt terms, we don't want to create the impression of an Israeli-style assassination program. They're just talking about killing Osama bin Laden. And so it's almost like a Talmudic code or something that you're reading with these lawyers in the Clinton White House. So Cheney and Bush despise Clinton. They think he's lawyering away America's national security, that he's a radical pacifist, essentially, and that he has handcuffed the CIA and handcuffed the Joint Special Operations Command and is not going to let them off the fence. 9/11 happens, and Cheney and Rumsfeld, they already knew about the agenda that they wanted to implement. They had telegraphed their pass by signing on to something called the Project for a New American Century, which was the Bible of the neoconservative movement. They wanted to redraw maps in the Middle East. They wanted to enact policies that would guarantee that there was only going to be one superpower in the world. And much of their vision initially had to do with limiting Russia's sphere of influence around the world, but they also had at their core the idea that the United States not only has a right to overthrow other governments, but is right to pursue the overthrow of other governments in the pursuit of natural resources or geostrategic dominance or geostrategic influence. So these guys come into office. 9/11 was like an incredible Christmas present for them that they used to justify a war on the world. I mean, it was shocking in retrospect. If you look in retrospect, it was shocking how much they got away with in just the first month after 9/11 in the name of security, but also by tapping into these incredible, real, deep fears experienced by so many Americans. Within days of 9/11, the US Congress passed a law called the Authorization for the Use of Military Force, the AUMF. If you read that law, it was a blank check for the Bush administration to wage a war around the world that would have no border, where the CIA and the US military would be able to essentially run the entire operation and where real rules did not apply. And there was no endgame in sight, no limitation to the duration of the conflict, and only one member of Congress in either house voted against it, one. And she was an African-American representative from the state of California named Barbara Lee. And I always tell young people, go on YouTube and watch Barbara Lee's speech. This is like a week after 9/11. And Barbara Lee stands up and she is trembling. Her hand is shaking. And she's reading her statement. They tried to pressure her not to do this. She received death threats. She actually thought she would be killed for giving this speech. Barbara Lee gets up in the midst of the hysteria around 9/11 and says, if we sign this, if Congress passes this and the president signs this into law, we will be going down a path where we become the very force that we seek to defeat. We will be throwing away our own values, and we will be engaged in a war that will have no end. And she was 100% right in what she was saying, and she was the only one at that moment that said it. Very similarly, when the Patriot Act, which was a draconian law primarily aimed inside of the United States, that rolled back tremendous amounts of civil liberties and freedoms in the United States, and implemented what is essentially a domestic surveillance state, only one member of the US Senate voted against it, who was a Democrat from Wisconsin named Russ Feingold. Everyone else fell into line, Democrats and Republicans alike. And they solidified this national security state, both abroad and at home. And everything that happened after that, the torture stemmed from Congress giving this authorization. Now, they'll say, oh, well, we didn't know that that was happening. They didn't tell us about waterboarding. We thought that this tactic was going to be used, but not that tactic. When you give individuals like Bush and Cheney a blank check, you have to game through what you think they're going to do with it, or you're not being a responsible lawmaker. All of these people, from Nancy Pelosi, who was the most powerful Democrat in the House at the time, to the most liberal members of the US Congress, in some form or another tried to justify voting for a law that they now realize voting for a bill that they now realize is a law that authorizes global war by the United States with very little respect for other nations' sovereignty. They've sought ways to justify it, and now they realize that they made a mistake and yet do nothing to correct it. And it remains the law that Obama cites when he justifies bombing Pakistan or doing drone strikes in Yemen. There's a phrase in that bill that actually says that it should be aimed at the people responsible or connected to 9/11. There have been people killed intentionally on orders of President Obama who were toddlers on 9/11. How is that possibly justified under that law? But it remains, it endures to this day. And so you had the CIA engaging in the creation of black sites around the world, in Poland and Thailand and elsewhere, where they're snatching people from one country, taking them to another, and unleashing on them all manner of horrifying medieval torture tactics. Rumsfeld and Cheney viewed most of the CIA as a liberal think tank, which is laughable to anyone who knows the history of the CIA, but they loved the CIA's paramilitary division. But what they loved more was JSOC. JSOC was a force that was created in 1980 after the failed hostage rescue mission in Iran, when the US Embassy in Tehran was seized following the Islamic Revolution. And there was this movie with Ben Affleck called Argo about going in and pretending to be a Canadian film crew. There was another operation that happened, which was the US military tried to go in and rescue the hostages, and it was a disaster. Helicopters went down. There was fighting between various entities of the US military, and JSOC was created, and the idea behind it was that it would be a small paramilitary style force that would act at the pleasure of the president and could be used for operations that the US would ultimately want to deny, or that had to be so sensitive that the US wouldn't have to take any responsibility for it. And for much of its career, JSOC existed in that manner and would be used in discrete operations or attach itself to other nations' military forces or engage in some form of a covert action. Cheney and Rumsfeld realized that the very nature of this organization was such that Congress would have almost nothing to do with it, and that the president could use them in an ultra-secretive way. And there's a doctrine in US military thinking called operational preparation of the battle space. And that provides that if the Secretary of Defense believes that hostilities are possible or likely in another nation around the world, that the US can forward deploy small numbers of its forces to prepare the battle space for an eventual larger scale US military operation. Rumsfeld, in one of his famous, they called them snowflake memos, he would write these little notes to his people and then send them down. Rumsfeld, didn't use a computer or anything. He would handwrite everything and then would have it couriered to someone. In one of his snowflake notes, he wrote, if we are at war against Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda doesn't have any actual territory that it's based from, that they could be anywhere, and if we have the right to prepare the battle space, then what is the battle space? The world is the battle space, is what Rumsfeld wrote on this memo. And that was what initiated this process of this elite, small commando force that was originally envisioned to be used in really small operations, becoming not just the primary force in targeted assassination around the world, but the policy itself. And the Joint Special Operations Command began to run its own prisons where they were doing interrogation. They had a prison in Iraq that was the site of some of the most heinous acts of torture committed since 9/11. It was called Camp Nama, which stood for Nasty Ass Military Area. And they would do things there like break people's knees with baseball bats, strip people naked, douse them in cold water, put them in front of an air conditioner. They did waterboarding. They would take people that they were interrogating and then take their wives into custody, bring their wives in and show them their screaming wife, put them back in the room, tell someone that they're being released, take them to a bus stop. 10 minutes later, hooded men come snatch them, bring them back, strip them naked, douse them in cold water, put them in front of an air conditioner. And they were using tactics that they had been taught during their training as commandos, as soldiers, from a program called the SEER program, the Survive, Evade, Resist, Escape. And that program is used to train U.S. Operators, military folks who work in the special operations or special forces world, for the kind of torture that you could endure if you end up in the hands of a lawless enemy that does not abide by the Geneva Conventions. And that course, the SEER course, is built on centuries of study of torture, including debriefings of American soldiers who have been held prisoner in every conflict since the founding of the American Republic. And so basically what it is, it's a catalog of torture techniques from enemies of the United States around the world throughout history. It also was a catalog of torture techniques in the United States during the Civil War. So they took these tactics that they would teach soldiers to expect if they were captured, and they reverse engineered them. And they began using these tactics on suspected Al-Qaeda people, on suspected militants, on people they believed would have information about who's doing improvised explosive device attacks against US troops. They reverse engineered a program that was intended to prepare soldiers for torture, to actually implement a regime of torture. And for much of the Bush-Cheney period, that White House was running a Murder Incorporated operation. And the head of JSOC at the time was General Stanley McChrystal, who of course was brought down not for any crime involving torture of prisoners or murdering large numbers of people, having large numbers of people murdered under his command, not just killed, but murdered. And there's a difference between killing and murder. And a lot of what happens is murder in war zones, not killing in a legitimate battlefield within the laws of war. He was brought down, of course, because he and his men said bad things about President Obama and Vice President Joe Biden in a bar in Paris, which is how you often get brought down in the U.S. You either sleep with the wrong person, who was not the person you're married to, or some reporter catches you saying something. You don't go down for anything actually resembling a crime or a war crime. So McChrystal is running this operation. Rumsfeld and Cheney are building this whole thing up, and everything, according to them, is going swimmingly. They start to operate first in 45 countries, then 75 countries. Some places they're training, some places they're bumping people off, places they're snatching people. They're doing operations without informing the governments of allied nations where they're operating, without informing the CIA station chief. The State Department has no idea who these guys are. Sometimes they would get into trouble, kill someone on the streets of a foreign city, and then the CIA would have to render them, actually snatch them and take them back to the US to avoid them being prosecuted locally in a city or country where they had been conducting a killing. You get into an argument with a taxi driver, boom, blow him away. That happened actually in Ecuador. They had to sneak him out of the country after he killed the taxi driver. So you have this kind of lawless atmosphere. You have this whole generation of special ops guys who have totally been let off the leash. They don't even see the backyard of the White House where Clinton previously had them chained to. They are just everywhere around the world. And this force is being built up. And then the unthinkable sort of happens in the minds of Cheney and Rumsfeld. A black socialist gets elected president of the United States. And all of these guys think, well, Obama's going to dismantle the whole thing. I mean, Cheney spent months in the first few months of Obama's presidency basically saying that the United States was going to sink and fall into the ocean because Obama is going to let Al-Qaeda govern the country and they're going to blow everything up. I mean, they had this fairy tale about Obama being this absolutely militant leftist, not a pacifist, but somehow a militant socialist who believed in violent revolution inside and outside the United States. Nothing could have been further from the truth, though. Barack Obama, while running for president, said all the right things about this stuff. Yes, I want to end torture. I'm going to shut down the black sites. We can't be engaged in dumb wars. I'm not going to deploy the American military in these misadventures. He was saying all of that. And a lot of the world projected onto him the image that they wanted to see without actually bothering to read the policy platform of his candidacy for president or looking at who his advisors were. For the most part, they were very hawkish Democratic Party elites. His foreign policy platform was far more hawkish and belligerent than President Clinton's was. But most people wanted to see the sort of man who was going to change everything about how America conducts its foreign policy. I mean, look at what happened when Obama came to Germany. It was like John Lennon had risen from the dead and done a one-night-only concert. I mean, it was this incredible sort of, you're saying no, but...
It's a long story, sorry.
I mean, how it played out in the United States was that it was this incredible Lollapalooza of Obama.
But it was about 2/3 American expats from all over Europe. It was not
I was making no comment on the nationality. I'm saying he comes here and it's like this international event where I think if John Lennon rose from the dead, you'd have people come from all over the world to see it. My point is that he was perceived as not just a political figure, but someone who could draw these massive crowds and sort of had ignited this spark. But then he comes into office, and Obama embraces all of these characters who are incredibly powerful figures within the history of black ops in the United States and covert ops, where you have General McChrystal, who ran JSOC, Admiral William McRaven, who also ran JSOC and created the kill capture program in the early days after 9/11 when he worked on the National Security Council. He was the original member of SEAL Team 6, the original Special Missions Unit. General David Petraeus, who was very close with Dick Cheney and a huge advocate of assassination as a central part of U.S. military policy in the so-called war on terrorism. And these individuals and the heads of all 16 U.S. intelligence agencies paint a picture for Obama of a world where there are thousands of concurrent threats against the U.S. homeland, and tell him that if you don't continue these authorizations that Bush gave us, in fact, if you don't expand some of them into countries like Yemen, we're going to get hit again in the homeland. Obama's political advisors, like Rahm Emanuel and David Axelrod, their primary concern was not U.S. national security. That wasn't their function in the White House. Their primary concern was the president's political ass and his reelection. And they're already thinking of his reelection in the first month of the presidency, and that's their job. They hear attack in the homeland, and they think one-term presidency, because it would have probably destroyed Obama's presidency. So they embrace this idea that they can kill their way to something resembling victory in a kind of war of attrition. And Obama begins to give even more sweeping authorizations to JSOC and the CIA, and he expands drone strikes. He campaigned on a pledge to close Guantanamo, and of course there are still prisoners being force-fed right now at Guantanamo. And the reason Guantanamo isn't closed is complicated. It's not just about Obama not engaging in a political fight. The Republicans are obstructing it by not giving the funding to shut it down. But Obama didn't want to put more people at Guantanamo. So the kill capture program largely became a kill program. And while he did escalate the presence of U.S. troops in Afghanistan, what was more significant was that he dramatically increased the number of night raids that were happening in that country, and the killing program where you had commandos from the U.S., Navy SEALs and Delta Force and Army Rangers kicking down doors, snatching people out of their houses, or going in and actually killing people. In the course of the sort of expansion of these covert wars, a series of orders are issued giving JSOC the ability to strike at a record number of countries. And Obama initiates a bombing campaign through drones and Tomahawk cruise missiles of Yemen. And so you have Yemen, Pakistan, there have been strikes in the Philippines, and then covert action in Africa, primarily focused around Somalia, where the U.S. is paying Somali warlords to hunt down individuals identified as members of Al-Shabaab, this militant group that pledged its allegiance to Al-Qaeda and was behind the Westgate shopping mall attack in Nairobi recently. And when I was in Mogadishu doing research for this book, I flew into the airport in Aden Ade and noticed a massive facility. This is under Obama. This is in the summer of 2011. A massive facility at the airport that looks like a forward operating base, like you would see in Afghanistan or somewhere else, Iraq. And it turns out that what it is a counterterrorism center, as the CIA calls it, where the U.S. is running an outsourced kill capture program where they're paying Somalis $200 a month in cash, literally lining them up to go out and hunt down people on these lists. The U.S. is also making use of a prison that is buried in the basement of Somalia's National Security Service, which is a U.S.-funded entity. And CIA personnel and French intelligence agents interrogate prisoners in this basement. And this basement prison is infested with bed bugs. Prisoners are not allowed access to the International Committee of the Red Cross. They're not allowed access to lawyers. Their family members, for the most part, have no idea where they are. I learned about this prison from a journalist, a Somali journalist, who was put in that prison after filming something that the US-backed African Union forces didn't want him to film, and they put him in there as a penalty for what he had done. Had I not met him, I wouldn't have known anything about that. I was able to research that prison and find the identities of people who had been taken there, including people who had been rendered, taken from one country, and then sent to Somalia at the request of the United States. So did Obama shut down the CIA's black sites? Yeah, I believe he did. Did he end the practice of extraordinary rendition? Sure, I'm willing to believe that too, except we just saw one happen the other day in Tripoli, Libya, where JSOC snatched this guy off the streets, put him in an aircraft and flew him to a ship. But for the most part, I think Obama has tried to stay away from U.S. forces doing those kinds of operations. So instead what we have is we're paying Somalis to hold these people in a prison where they're being tortured. And the CIA people come in, they're not doing the torture, they just have a few questions they want to ask. But they know damn well what's going on there. Maybe we're not, doing all these assassinations and capture operations in Somalia, but instead we're paying other people to do it, including notorious warlords who at one point in history were giving shelter to the people who blew up the US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. On one level, yes, there has been change. On another level, there's a backdoor way of continuing these programs. And to me, the most high stakes aspect of the Obama presidency when it comes to counterterrorism and national security is not about him being worse than Bush. Bush and Cheney were murder incorporated. It's that he's taken his credibility and put a stamp of legitimacy on operations that I think would have been considered extremely dangerous and potentially illegal if a Republican was engaged in them. If John McCain had won that election, I don't think for a moment that liberals would have sat by silently watching these drone wars expand in the way that many have. It's not all that all have. There's a diverse debate in the United States. But a lot of people, you get the sense just from the polls, just seem to think, well, Obama has control. He has it in his hands. I trust Obama. It's as though there's Democratic drone strikes and Republican drone strikes, which of course is just intellectually bankrupt. And so we're in this moment where Obama and his team have Terror Tuesday meetings where they meet on Tuesdays and decide whose name is going to go up on the kill list or who's going to go on the capture list. And they're creating something called the disposition matrix, which is sort of an algorithm for determining kill capture operations and where they should take place. And if they're in this place, should we work with the local government or does it require unilateral action? And he has argued at the Nobel Committee, when he got his prize, at the United Nations recently, at his inauguration, that the US not only has a right to do these things, but is right to do them in defense of itself and democracy as we know it in the world. And Obama is a very effective salesperson on this issue, particularly inside the US. I don't know, I don't spend enough time in Europe to get a clear sense of it, but in the US, I think he's been very effective. The only real opposition to this policy that you see manifested in any way in the US Congress, certainly, is from people who, for all practical purposes, are absolute lunatics, from the Tea Party in the United States. They will come out, if Obama says he wants to use drone strikes, they will come out and say drone strikes are war crimes. Sarah Palin, who shoots creatures from her helicopter, tweeted against Obama's drone program the other day. She would love this program if it was John McCain or Romney or any other Republican doing it. So I don't have any illusions about most of those people operating based on principle. But the Democrats in the Congress, the ones who were confronting the Bush national security state, either have been totally silent or have been cheerleading the president's national security policy. When President Obama's renomination occurred for the Democratic candidacy for president of the United States, I watched the Democratic National Convention where they were constantly spiking the football of killing Osama bin Laden. In U.S. streets, it was like a sporting event at times. In Washington, D.C., you have all these drunk kids coming out. They're chanting USA. It's like the U.S. had won the World Cup, which is never going to happen. But it was like that. It was sort of surreal. So you have this president who has this credibility, who is an incredibly brilliant man, using a good deal of his political collateral to pay forward the idea that the United States has a right to be doing these things and is right to be doing them. And I think that years from now, liberals, particularly in the United States, will realize that this was sort of a turning point. I do think that on some level, Dick Cheney, who of late has been very quiet about Obama, is having a good chuckle somewhere, in his cave, because I don't think this would have been possible under a Republican, or it wouldn't have been possible without very substantial pushback. So we then arrive at the point where President Obama is faced with the decision on whether or not to kill this American citizen who had not been charged with a crime. And he authorizes that killing. And it happens. And the reaction in Washington fell into two camps: celebration and praise, or silence. When Robert Gibbs, who was President Obama's surrogate on the campaign, was asked about this, he was enthusiastic in his support for it. Of course the president should be doing these. John McCain praised it. All these Republicans, all these powerful Democrats were praising this thing. 2 weeks after that al-Awlaki was killed, another drone strike happened in Yemen, and the victim this time was a 16-year-old American citizen who had just turned 16, and his only crime appears to have been that his father was Anwar al-Awlaki. He was killed while having dinner sitting with his teenage cousins. The White House has never explained why this kid was killed. Never. Robert Gibbs said he should have had a more responsible father, implying that his death was justifiable because of who his dad was. The kid hadn't seen his dad in 3 years. He was being raised by his grandparents, one of whom is a very well-respected scholar with multiple degrees from the United States, who founded a university in Yemen and works closely with USAID. They have nothing to do with terrorism, except that this one person from their family was engaged in an online jihad against the United States and calling for Western Muslims to conduct attacks in their own societies. This kid gets killed. No one says anything about it, and it's a total non-issue in the United States. When lawyers for the families of the survivors, these Americans killed, tried to file lawsuits, the Obama administration intervened and argued state secrets and said, we have evidence of criminality here, but if we put it onto the record, it will damage American national security. And they have the heads of the CIA, the Defense Department, National Security, FBI, inundate the courts with memos saying, if you as a judge allow this case to be heard, it will damage the United States national security. They're doing that under something called the state secrets privilege, which Obama pledged to stop using in an arbitrary or capricious way when he was campaigning for president. He uses it constantly now to quash any challenge to the global kill program. So right now we have the NSA scandal. We have journalists in the United States who are having their metadata tracked. We have whistleblowers that are being prosecuted in record numbers. Obama has used the Espionage Act, which was passed in 1917, primarily aimed at confronting people involved with espionage for Germany, using it to go after people who provide information to journalists. If you blow the whistle on torture or abuse, you run the risk of going to prison. If you were part of the CIA torture program, you're on a book tour, like Jose Rodriguez, who ran the torture program. When Obama came into office, and the issue of whether or not to hold these torturers accountable came up, at the end of the day, Obama's final statement on it was that we have to look forward, not backwards. And no one was prosecuted for their involvement in torture, only prosecuted for blowing the whistle on torture. So I want to stop there and open it up for discussion. I don't mean to be so depressing. I normally do hand out razor blades with my talks, but I think at the end of the day, the bottom line is this. Whether it's Obama or it's Bush, there's a permanent national security state in the United States. JSOC as an entity, the CIA and its paramilitary division are going to live on. Some presidents try to tame the beast, others try to feed the beast, but at the end of the day, the beast is indeed a beast. And I think that is the real issue that needs to be confronted. And when you have a highly polarized partisan society, as we do, especially right now in the United States, it becomes almost impossible to look at the root causes of this. I'm not obsessed with drones. Drones are a platform. I'm happy to talk about the issues and implications for drones in Europe and elsewhere. But at the end of the day, I'm more concerned about the ideology or philosophy or policies that necessitate or encourage the use of weapons like drones. So with that, I'll stop and hear debate, discussion. If anyone wants to yell at me or disagree, I'm happy with that too. But anyway, thank you very much for your time.
Okay, without much ado, the floor is yours. And I can't imagine
Is the format here just people ask?
that there's no one who is willing to break the ice first. Here you go.
Could you wait for the mic, please?
Oh, absolutely.
First of all, thank you for coming to Germany and coming to Berlin. It's really appreciated. We accidentally saw your documentary last night on TV, and this morning I looked at your Twitter feed and I saw that you had a good dinner in Berlin, so I was wondering if you were sticking around, and I guess we were lucky. So thanks again for this. I was wondering, do you feel that there was a moment when the industrial military complex sort of took hold of government? Was there a turning point?
You know, well, thank you for that also. And I should say that my publisher here, Kunstmann, is a really great independent publisher. And this woman, Antje Kunstmann, who's the founder of it, it sort of came out of the student movement and is a really awesome radical feminist who has published some fantastic books, and I've just been really honored. So it was my birthday that night, and she treated me to an awesome dinner because her friends had that restaurant, and it was really, her and her son Moritz have been really kind to me, and Moritz edited my book and had to turn something that would have been like, I think 1,200 pages in German to something slightly less than 1,200 pages. So was there a turning point? I think that would be difficult to say. I mean, I do think that when President Eisenhower gave his farewell address, he talked about the military-industrial complex in the context of the weapons industry. I don't think he necessarily envisioned a world where the U.S. would be using private contractors and proxy forces in the way that they're now being used. But big corporations are, for all practical purposes, in control of the political system in the United States through a legalized form of bribery and corruption in our campaign finance system. In some societies, you have to bring suitcases of cash to dictators to get access to natural resources. In the U.S., you just donate huge amounts of money, donate in quotes, to the campaigns of Democrats and Republicans. I think part of the reason that you don't see a very robust questioning of the fundamental roots of why the United States has such a kind of hawkish foreign policy is that it's not in the interests of many in Congress to engage in those issues. Defense corporations give incredible amounts of money to Democrats and Republicans alike. In the last two election cycles, the war industry gave more money to Democrats than Republicans because they rightly calculated that Obama was going to win and was going to stay in office. So I don't know what you could exactly tie it to, but it certainly has radically accelerated in the aftermath of World War II. And a lot of it was justified, and I know Bernd is working on this right now, a lot of it is justified by the politics of fear. The war on communism, the war on terror, everything is a war now, war on drugs, we have even a war on cancer, all of these things is all war, and war generally has militarized solutions for it. But I also think it's about the imperial presidency. We were talking about this before. These corporations make possible the imperial presidency. There's constant need for new toys of war. They're supporting the very people that are going to implement the policies that they want to see. And there's been a real power grab on the executive branch of the US government. Under Bush and Cheney, but also under Obama, where, Susan and I were talking earlier, Congress and the courts in the United States are no great shakes either. Congress has an 11% approval rating right now. Edward Snowden has 5 times that in the United States, so it's for all the sort of bashing of him that they do. Congress has an 11% approval rating, and more than 50% of Americans think Edward Snowden is a whistleblower. So, I don't know, you can ask John Boehner about that.
Susan?
Thank you, Jeremy, for a very exciting and provocative talk. And we did talk a bit about the dilemma that someone who wants to criticize Obama from the left, and I belong to that, and so do pretty much all my friends, the dilemma that we stand in. And of course, probably the job of a journalist is to do exactly what you're doing. That is to expose crimes and injustice wherever you find them and leave the rest of the questions for other people. But I do want to raise a couple of questions to what you said. Like you, at the end of the Bush regime, I very much wanted trials for war crimes. I just thought that this was the most criminal regime and that, in United States history, and that if we didn't do something like, this is very interesting because I live in Germany, something like what the Germans had done with their own criminal past, we were culpable. It's important to remember that it took decades for the Germans to do it with their own criminal past. I was impatient at the time and thought, doesn't matter, that's not an argument, I want to do it now. And of course Obama said this kind of uncomfortably, mealy-mouth American thing about we look to the future and not to the past. Yeah. How do you think, this is the first question, how could a man who failed to get the mildest of gun control reforms through the Congress that were desired by 94% of the American people, how would that man, or a health care bill which is worse than any right-wing government in Europe would accept. How could he conceivably, practically, get through war crimes trials? Leads to my second question, which you did mention. His first act on becoming president was to say he was going to shut down Guantanamo within a year. I have every reason to believe that, that was a sincere act. I have asked a number of people who are privileged to, many more state secrets than I am, how he could actually have gotten that through. And I haven't been given an answer by anyone. Third, very briefly, you mentioned it yourself with Congress's 11% approval rating. Yes, we're concerned about the imperial presidencies, but it was quite interesting that the conference or workshop that Bernd mentioned that we held here in this room was taking place the weekend that Congress was voting on the health care reform. And it was the feeling of people then that actually the problem was not the imperial presidency, but what had happened to our balance of powers. Last question. I agree with you that the killing of Al-Waqi's 16-year-old son is reprehensible. It's not true that nobody's discussed it in the States. The New York Times even printed a letter from his grandfather. But you...
A year after he was killed. But
Yeah,
yes.
there's no way that I'm defending it.
And I had something to do with that op-ed. I know a lot about the process of that. I know that family very well. Believe me, it was fighting tooth and nail to get anything printed like that. So I actually know a lot about that issue.
Okay. If you do, and this is really not to defend targeted assassinations, it's just to say, what do you do with someone like Father Anwar al-Awlaki, who is preaching, violent terrorism, and attempting to incite people all over the world to repeat it? I'm not saying the answer is to kill him. I'm just saying, what do you do?
That's fair. Okay, wow, there's a lot there. I have it all. Okay, so first on the issue of, just to boil it down to the simplest point that you made for the sake of discussion, and you feel free to jump in if I ever mischaracterize anything you asked here. How could Obama, who failed to get control of the sort of healthcare issue or some of the other pieces of legislation, gun control that he tried to pursue, how could he have effectively prosecuted torturers or dealt with the war crimes issue? First of all, I don't know that it would have been, I don't know that it was, war crimes is a specific set of things, and I think it would have been very difficult for Obama to wage a campaign where he said, we're going to have war crimes trials or we're going to put people on trial for torture. But there is no need to have Congress involved with that whatsoever. Obama is a constitutional lawyer. There is ample evidence of actual crimes that were committed by CIA personnel, by U.S. military personnel.
But do you really think he could have gotten Cheney and Rumsfeld?
No, I don't think he would have gone after Cheney and Rumsfeld because that's a different political question. That would have set a precedent. I think he should have, but I don't think he would have. Not necessarily because he didn't think that there was evidence against them, but because it would have made him someone completely different who did not actually believe in sort of radical American exceptionalism. I don't think he would have touched them ever under any circumstances. The question, as I understand it from talking to people, was that Obama was considering prosecuting some of the actual people who did the torture or authorized the torture on an operational level at black sites or elsewhere. I think that the fact that they chose to prosecute no one for this. My understanding is that it had nothing to do with believing they didn't have evidence, or even a question of political will. I think it was because they were told, if you do this, you will shatter the morale of everyone in the CIA and the U.S. military. And to me, that's a terrible reason, a horrifying reason to not prosecute criminals in that manner. They prosecute. We have people serving life sentences in the United States for nonviolent possession of drugs, as you well know. And Jose Rodriguez, who ran the torture program, he literally is on a book tour And his book, I feel like sending that to the Justice Department, just saying, just rewrite this a little bit and you have your indictment. He's bragging about his role in torture and bragging about keeping Congress in the dark. I'm sorry, principle is principle. At the end of the day, I think Obama didn't need Congress the way that he needed them for health care or gun control. They don't vote on who gets indicted. So, I mean, you can defend Obama's decision not to do it from a political perspective. From a legal perspective, I think it's pretty unforgivable given the amount of torture that we know took place. I mean, I think that by allowing these people to get away with it and actually profit off of their role in it, it sends a message, that the U.S. doesn't really take these crimes seriously. I mean, I'm sure you disagree with me on this. It's just.
I think you would have gotten the little people without getting Cheney and Rumsfeld.
Well, I also don't believe in that. I mean, I ultimately think that Cheney and Rumsfeld both belong in a prison cell, and but I also think that the people at the operational level in the CIA who were dumping water into prisoners' mouths, knowing what it was doing, also should be held accountable. But I believe in top-down, going after the people who set the policy. What was really disturbing is that when Guantanamo prisoners who have died under very mysterious circumstances their families tried to sue Donald Rumsfeld in his capacity as defense secretary, the Obama administration intervened, and Deputy Attorney General Tony West submitted a brief that said that even if Rumsfeld was guilty of torture, genocide, forced relocation, or deportation, that it was within the official scope of his duties as defense secretary. They also said that that's true of CIA and State Department personnel. If you don't believe me, you can check it online. I used to quote from it when I would speak at universities, said, this is not Bush's Justice Department. This was the Deputy Attorney General, Tony West, under Obama, submitted something that said even if Rumsfeld was engaged in genocide, it would have been within the official scope, that's the phrase, official scope of his duties. And it's stunning how this administration has intervened in these cases to preserve secrecy and to actually, it's not about not prosecuting, they're also defending Rumsfeld, General Myers, who was the chair of the Joint Chiefs at the time, the former heads of CIA. They intervene in all these lawsuits. And not to say, we have a different way of viewing this, but it ends the lawsuits because they assert sovereign immunity and the whole thing gets thrown out of court. This is the big battle the ACLU and Center for Constitutional Rights are fighting. Obama and Gitmo, I agree with you. I think it's horribly embarrassing to Obama, incredibly frustrating to him. I think it was one of his major priorities was to shut down Guantanamo. He brought on people like Greg Craig and others who were very effective political organizers and operatives in Washington who believed that they were going to be shutting down that camp. And a large part of why it can't get shut down is because the Republicans are controlling the purse strings, and they keep blocking it. And they have effectively argued with enough Democrats and convinced them of the rightness of not transferring these individuals back to the U.S. They use fear-mongering also. So, I do think that the Gitmo issue is one where I have no doubt that Obama wanted to shut that down. Congressional role obstruction, I completely agree. I think Congress is just a reprehensible institution at this point, particularly in the current context. On the issues that are most important to me that I cover, Congress has been horrible. The Republicans, it's a no-brainer. Democrats have been incredibly disappointing. On the issue of Al-Awlaki and targeted assassination, what do you do with someone like him? Well, I'd like to know what the actual law he broke was. And the way we discover that is not by having an edict of the death penalty. I think he should have been indicted. If even 1/100th of what the Obama administration has leaked about Al-Awlaki was true, why not go and indict him? Even posthumously, they're not presenting any evidence. They're just declaring these things were true. As I said earlier, I think Al-Awlaki was a reprehensible person. But our values as a democratic society aren't tested by easy cases or by law-abiding citizens. I don't think that we should be killing American citizens, or non-American citizens for that matter. I don't think American lives are worth more than non-American lives in sort of pre-crime operations or by fiat. And I think that what Obama talked about as the standard for using for this use of force, he said it boils down to an imminent threat where capture is not feasible, and he compared Anwar al-Awlaki to a sniper who is pointing a weapon at a crowd of innocent people, and pointed out, rightly in the case of a sniper, you don't need to go get an indictment. You don't have to put them on trial. In an act of collective self-defense of the people they're going to kill, law enforcement has a right to take that person out. That wasn't the case with Al-Awlaki. They had Al-Awlaki under surveillance for 30 days in a village with 10 houses. There was no official extradition request. The tribal leaders I interviewed who are in control of that territory said no one ever came to them and asked them to hand over Al-Awlaki. Maybe there's plausible explanations as to why the White House felt that capture was not feasible. I have no doubt that members of the Navy SEALs could have gone in and snatched Anwar al-Awlaki at that point. So why? Why is it that you would do that? To me, that's a question. The onus is on the president to explain why that's acceptable. The onus isn't on me to say, well, why shouldn't we kill someone who hasn't been charged with a crime and is not actively shooting at U.S. soldiers on a battlefield? He's making YouTube videos. And if he was engaged in plotting the underwear bomb plot, indict him if you have evidence for that. They never charged him. To me, it was strategically idiotic of them to not charge him with a crime. I still would have been opposed to what they did, because I don't believe in assassination in that way at all. But they would have had a better case to make, I think, particularly given Obama's credibility in the legal world.
Okay, as of now, I have 3 people on my list, and I would suggest that we hear these 3 in consecutive order.
I'll take notes
that
on them.
You take your notes and have an opportunity to answer later on. You were first, and then there was someone to my right at the very back, and then you, exactly.
Thank you very much. I have 2 very short questions. The first one may sound like a joke after your talk tonight. Is the United States still a Rechtsstaat, a state of justice? That is my first question. But it is a question for me with very earnest background.
Not a state of justice, but a
Rechtsstaat.
a state obeying the law.
Yeah. The second question follows the first question tonight. You spoke about Obama's noble campaign. And I can only confess I was a fan with this noble campaign. Of course I was. Do you see any turning point for him personally to change to a fighter of drones?
Ich habe auch 2 Fragen. Die erste, ich habe irgendwann gelesen, ich weiß nicht mehr in welchem Zusammenhang, aber vor kurzem, dass die Vereinigten Staaten für gewisse Gebiete die Freiheit von Strafverfolgung für ihre Angehörigen und Soldaten fordern. Freiheit von Strafverfolgung, also steht das in einem Zusammenhang damit, dass Sie befürchten müssen, dass amerikanische Staatsbürger zur Rechenschaft gezogen werden, so wie Sie es ja beschreiben bei World is a Battlefield. Die zweite Frage, ob Sie die religiöse Rechte in irgendeinen Zusammenhang stellen können mit Clash of Civilizations, ob Sie dazu etwas sagen können. Also handelt es sich vielleicht nicht bloß um einen Versuch, die Einflusssphäre Amerikas zu vergrößern und wirtschaftliche Interessen durchzusetzen, sondern letztlich auch um einen religiösen Krieg zwischen Christentum und dem Islam.
Okay, the first question was to comment on the background of why the American government is unwilling, incapable, or most of all unwilling to pursue military personnel and intelligence personnel, which at the time of their duty were involved in acts of torture or breaching laws. And the second question was whether this policy is somehow tuned into a religious ideological undercurrent or mainstream, as I understood from your question and your interpretation of these developments, whether it has anything to do with a religious fight or willingness to define the world in religious terms, a clash of civilization building on these religious notions. Okay, one more. That's you.
Okay, Jeremy, my question is the following. You did not really give us your take on if you are against drone strikes in general, or if there's a scenario you could imagine where drone strikes would be a means, a good means to kill terrorists, like in these personality strikes they first introduced in 2004. There are other war correspondents, like, for example, David Rode.
David who?
David Rode.
Yeah, David Rode.
Who say that these drone strikes, the Bush and the Obama administration did, that they have been effective to kill and to reduce the Al Qaeda leadership. So I'd like you to comment on this. What your take is on this?
Okay. The first question is the U.S. state of justice. I often sort of cringe when people, characterize the United States as, totalitarian, it's eating its own, it's an anti-democratic society. Not because I don't think that there are some totalitarian tendencies within the state in the U.S. Of course there are. We have laws in the United States that, in the scope of the Western democratic world, are incredible. Our First Amendment in the United States, which enshrines the idea of a free press, doesn't exist in Britain. I have to deal with edits to things I write in Britain that are atrocious. U.S. lawyers laugh at the deference to the powerful under certain British law compared to the First Amendment in the United States and the official on-paper protection of journalists. At the same time, those laws are openly violated by the U.S. government on a regular basis. This question about, you asked about the idea of a rule of law. We have some incredibly progressive laws in the United States. The issue is whether they're implemented fairly and justly. On an international level, no, the United States is not actually a state of laws. And I think it's kind of, it's embarrassing, I think, that the United States refuses to endorse an actual international criminal court. In the 90s, there were Republicans, when there was talk during the Clinton administration of the U.S. actually accepting the idea of an international court or a world court, there were Republicans in the U.S. Congress that said that if that happened, they would introduce legislation that they called the Hague Invasion Act, that would authorize U.S. military personnel to go to the Hague to rescue any Americans charged with war crimes. You really get the perception. We can say this about Russia and China too at the United Nations with their veto power. But you get the perception that the United States position is generally that there's one set of rules that apply to the U.S. and its closest allies and another set of rules for other nations around the globe. And you see that very clearly in some of these operations where the U.S. asserts that it has every right to violate the sovereignty of other nations, to snatch people or to kill them. But I do think that the NSA scandal is starting a dialogue that I think is tapping into some of this. But no, I think there are wonderful things about American law, and I feel lucky to live in a country where I can point to something and say you're violating this. I know journalists who have been outright murdered on the streets in other countries, and no one says anything about it, and there's never an investigation. There are journalists who are kidnapped, whose lives are threatened every single day around the world. And my primary concern is over their rights right now. In the U.S., we face a whole regime of pressure. We get detained at airports. We're being surveilled. Occasionally, there are journalists who are locked up. There are journalists threatened with imprisonment. Journalists are murdered in the streets of Mexico every single week. So I think journalism globally is under attack, and it takes on a different face in the United States, and it takes on a different face in other places. I don't think that Obama is going to all of a sudden become an anti-drone activist at some point in life. I do think that that there are people in Obama's administration that are going to write memoirs that are going to shed very serious light on how problematic that policy has been, the idea that the United States can wage preemptive war or sort of pre-crime in these strikes. But I don't think Obama I don't think he's been like the grand magician who's tricked all the liberals. I think Obama generally has done what he said he was going to do, and I think some of the criticism against him is a little disingenuous, because I do think that Obama projected a lot of this. If people bothered to actually read past the stump speech that admittedly was a great stump speech, but that's not where policy is dictated or envisioned. Our friend here asked a comment on the background of the U.S. to pursue military or intelligence personnel involved in torture. Just reiterating part of what I said there. I think that the main reason for it was not a legal reason, was not necessarily a political reason, though that may have been a factor in the case of people like Rumsfeld or Cheney. But I do think at the end of the day that Obama believed that if he did that, it would completely undermine any authority he had as the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Armed Forces. And I tend to think he probably was right about that, but I still think it was the wrong decision. because I ultimately think that for the moral fabric of our society, I think it would have been more important to hold those people accountable. But that's why I don't run for office, and I'm sitting here with you, because I wouldn't be a realist or what have you. On the religious ideology question, that's a very interesting question. There are some very scary Christian supremacists in very high-ranking military positions in the United States. And there is this whole lore and cult of crusader ideology that exists and runs through the U.S. military. I mean, I've interviewed people, and they are scary. And there are definitely people who signed up to go murder Muslims because they're Muslims. And I mean, I don't even think we have scratched the surface of how sick and twisted some of the neo-crusader entities within the U.S. military are. I would never paint the whole military with a broad brush in the United States. And I have friends in the military who I have tremendous respect for and don't believe have any motivation in their body to be going and killing people based on their religion. But I think there are also some psychopaths and sociopaths that do these things. And
Mostly Max Boot types.
well, no, but I don't think of Max Boot as being a Christian supremacist in that way. I think Max Boot has never met a U.S. military intervention that he wasn't in love with. And he's a big pro-America imperialist who, of course, will never ever go and fight in any of the wars that he loves everyone else's children to fight. He's a chicken hawk of the worst order. I mean, he's part of the 83rd Chairborne Division. He's just, I have no respect for those people whatsoever. You asked an interesting question about drone strikes. Am I against drone strikes in general, or if there's a scenario where I think they're acceptable? And you asked about the personality strikes and citing David Rhodey and others saying that drones can be an effective way, and they've actually reduced the strength of Al-Qaeda. As I said toward the end of my speech, I mean, to me, I think there is an over-obsession with drones. Drones are a platform. A cruise missile, for instance, including with the use of cluster bombs, which are like flying landmines that most nations in the world believe should be banned, is an exponentially more devastating weapon than a Hellfire missile fired from a Reaper drone. If you've seen the aftermath of a cruise missile strike and what it does to a wide blast radius of people, shredding them into ground beef, basically, and I've seen that in a number of countries, it's horrifying. The blast radius of drone missiles is much more confined, which is part of the argument that they make. Well, this is a more precise weapon, which is why I wouldn't answer. My answer to your question on drone strikes, it has nothing to do with the fact that they're drones, and it has to do with what is the operation. What's the basis for it? Is it about self-defense? Is it actually out of some kind of necessity that international law dictates is acceptable? There are things that I think are immoral but happen to be legal under international law. Most international lawyers agree on strikes in certain areas of Pakistan being legitimate because it's an active armed conflict area. We might think it's immoral for them to do it or not the best law, but there is an argument that there's a legality to some of those operations. There are two, as you I'm sure know, two different kinds of drone strikes. There's personality strikes, like the one that killed Anwar al-Awlaki, where you know the person you're trying to kill, you're hunting them down, you find them, and you kill them. And then there are signature strikes, where you're targeting people whose identities you may not actually know, and against whom you may not have actual evidence that they're involved in terrorism, but they've given you enough of a reason to believe they may be up to terrorist activity. They're communicating with a certain group of people on mobile phone or SMS or via chat or email. They attend a certain mosque and then go to an internet cafe, and the US has been watching those places. And you determine this group of people or this person is probably involved with terrorism, and you authorize a strike against them on the basis of the potential that they're involved with terrorism. And those strikes are limited to certain areas of Pakistan and Yemen. I don't know that the US has ever done one elsewhere. Those to me are a really dangerous road to go down, because they're like Philip K. Dick. I mean, it's like Minority Report, which was made into this film with Tom Cruise. And it amounts to pre-crime, and I think it's highly unlawful. I mean, when I talked to Ben Emerson, who is the UN rapporteur on extrajudicial killing, I mean, he basically said that he thinks that the signature strikes have to end, and he says that he's communicated this to very senior U.S. officials. Have they been effective at reducing Al-Qaeda? No question. I mean, there are people that have died in drone strikes who were major figures involved with plotting terrorist attacks. That doesn't necessarily mean that by killing them, we've created a greater good or helped the cause of peace. To me, it's less interesting about who we've killed in Al-Qaeda than the impact of our actions, even if we're killing people who are legitimately nefarious, awful, criminal individuals. I think we're going to experience blowback from the use of drone strikes in part because of the propaganda value. It's akin to the torture at Abu Ghraib or the opening of Guantanamo. Even in cases where you kill someone and you believe it was legitimate, I still think that there could be a ricochet effect that undermines the intended point of the operation. You know, I've heard from numerous people recently within the CIA and U.S. military special operations community who have indicated that there's a growing chorus of voices from inside who are coming to the conclusion that what is called America's national security policy or counterterrorism policy is actually undermining American national security by opening the door for giving people a legitimate reason to want to fight the United States. To me, that's the debate that should be happening within intelligence and military communities. So no, it's not that I have a visceral, oh, drones are the problem. In fact, I think that's a problematic argument to make. So what if they say, okay, we won't use drones anymore, we'll go back to just using all cruise missiles? That doesn't solve the issue at all.
One of the interesting sides of being a moderator is you can decide on the overtime. So I decided to have those 4 who are now on my list and who want to ask questions.
Now, is this a kill list, Bernd?
Oh, no, okay. Definitely.
Did you meet on Tuesday with Susan about this?
That's an opportunity and empowering list, intellectually empowering. So 4 more, and please be as brief as you possibly can in asking your question or questions. Uh-oh. Okay. 5, and you're the last. 6-1.
And I will be far less
you'll be probably
loquacious than I've been.
Yeah. The first was the lady to my left. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Jeremy. Yeah. The first thing that I want to just say is that it's really a pleasure to have you here. And I think that the strategic choice to not indict al-Awlaki was actually quite smart, because now everyone who puts something up on YouTube has to think, is this problematic? And that goes into my question, which is, as a member of the media, you've talked about fear and tapping into fear. And I want to know how you see the media as a contrast to tapping into fear. Instead of building up more fear, how can we have other alternatives?
Cool, and thank you for your kind words.
Thank you. There was a gentleman to my left. Okay, then it's yours.
I have a more global question. So, I mean, we had Malala Yousafzai, this 16-year-old Pakistani girl. It took actually her to ask Obama if drone strikes don't fuel terrorism and radicalize people because they kill innocent people. I mean, it took a 16-year-old from Pakistan to ask the Nobel Peace Prize winner to ask her the most obvious questions, kind of. But on the other hand side, I mean, he obviously didn't really respond to her. And what you indicated on fight on journalism, which actually, or war on terrorism, which started, I mean, you did not mention Michael Hastings, which I think should be mentioned. So the guy who got killed.
He was a very good friend of mine.
We has been, right, yeah. So, yeah, so my question is how do we, I mean, here from a European point of view, what's the chance we have, as obviously the powers that normally exist within a legal system to overcome difficulties in democratic process, if things get unbalanced, if people privatize things that shouldn't be privatized and so on. So how, I'm not sure, because the United States seems to give a shit on international reputation. What's the way, or could you maybe indicate where you see a chance what we as Europeans can do to react to this situation?
Meine Frage geht in die gleiche Richtung. Man könnte den Eindruck haben, nur dank Leuten wie Ihnen stehen die USA nicht am Abgrund. Dennoch wäre es ironisch, wenn ich Sie fragen würde, was wir zum Beispiel in Deutschland oder Europa tun könnten gegen diese gefährliche Politik. Also drehe ich die Frage. Meinen Sie, es würde die amerikanische Politik oder die Demokratie in Amerika in irgendeiner Form beeindrucken, wenn zum Beispiel in Deutschland im Laufe der nächsten 4 bis 8 Jahre auf der Basis einer, sagen wir, rot-grün-roten Mehrheit eine stärker antimilitaristische Politik versucht würde, etwa derart, dass die Bewegungs- und Rederechte der amerikanischen Geheimdienste hier strikt kontrolliert und eingeschränkt werden, dass die Visapolitik gegenseitig wird oder dass man im UN-Sicherheitsrat die Vetos kippt.
Okay, this question actually is in line with your predecessor, and the question was, would it in any way impress any American administration, be it Democratic, Republican, or whatsoever, if from Europe we had a core of voices criticizing more solidly and more impressively than it is done today, and if Europe came to a point, be it Germany or not, of putting American intelligence officers, military officers who are involved in this illegal global war under pressure, call them to justice, extradite them, or even introduce passport controls of everyone trying to leave the country on illegal terms. Okay, Karl Tam, and then the lady right here. You have the privilege of being the last. Karl Tam first. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I have almost a philosophical question. The thing is, what is your impression? After all these activities you describe has now gone on for quite a time, and adding to that 2 major wars, and adding to that a number of minor wars. Well, does it have any impact? Is terrorism today not a threat anymore, or a lesser threat than it supposed to be 10 years ago? Can you imagine a situation when an American president, Obama, or a successor of him will say, well, we are safe?
That's a good question. Okay.
One more. Sure.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
One more. The lady in the black sweater.
Thank you for sharing your insights with us this evening, and I have actually 2 brief questions. The first is, what happens when you hold this kind of speech in the United States? And the second is, I'm quite curious and would like to know a bit more about who are these paramilitary soldiers? Are they kind of traumatized veterans who have fought in a couple of wars? Or maybe you can give a bit more information about that. Thank you.
Wow, there's a lot here. Okay. Thank you for that, by the way. Yeah, it was an extraordinary moment when Malala met with Obama. And my understanding is not just that she asked him, but that she she made a statement to him to the effect that she thought that it was actually increasing terrorism, and that, and asked him to stop, which is ironic if you boil it down to just the raw fact of what happened in that room, is that a Nobel Peace Prize loser asked a Nobel Peace Prize winner to stop bombing her country, which is sort of amazing. It's incredible, and all power to that amazing young woman. For all sorts of reasons, what she endured. She's getting hit from both ends, is what she's saying. She gets shot in the head by these brutal medieval thugs, and then, is with the most powerful individual in the world and says, please stop bombing, in a campaign that Obama would have said is aimed at people that shot her in the head. It's profound, her sort of wisdom and courage, I would say. I really think she should have gotten the Nobel Prize. I think the committee did this thing with the chemical weapons thing to try to encourage that process to continue as a political statement. I mean, I'm saying that's why I think happened. You referenced Michael Hastings. I mean, I don't want to get into this in its entirety, but Michael Hastings was a tremendous journalist. He was the guy that brought down General Stanley McChrystal. He was a very dear friend of mine. He died in a horrifying car crash a few months ago in Los Angeles. We don't know what happened that night, and I think anytime, particularly someone who's high profile is killed in mysterious or questionable circumstances, it should be entirely investigated. But I know and also his family members and his close friends find it deeply offensive that people have gone way overboard in declaring that they know beyond a doubt that Michael was murdered because of his reporting, and I think that it's painful enough for that family. But I think that most of us, what we would say is that we want to know how Michael died and what were the circumstances, and he certainly was involved with high-profile investigations of powerful people. But it doesn't help anyone to speculate because the truth gets lost then, and especially when it's someone that you know and it's a colleague. And we're all journalists. We want it investigated completely. And I don't think that the local authorities in the area where he was killed in Los Angeles have done a very effective job thus far of investigating, and I'm very disappointed in that. I'll merge these two together about European response to these actions, and then if Europe had to acquire a voice criticizing the U.S., and more interestingly, if they started perhaps charging U.S. officials or implementing passport controls. I did an event the other night here in Germany. Actually, it was in Berlin, with Wolfgang Kalick of the European Center for Constitutional Rights. And Wolfgang is a tremendous lawyer and has worked closely with some very prominent American lawyers on the issue of trying to prosecute Donald Rumsfeld and using German and other European countries' laws. Of course, we remember the very high-profile detention of Augusto Pinochet and the role that Baltasar Garzón, the Spanish judge, played in trying to indict others from Chile as well as Pinochet, and to hold them accountable for their crimes. I mean, ultimately, I do believe that European nations have every right, and I think that it's one of the few ways that you can effectively challenge U.S. officials is by taking those actions. I don't necessarily think they're going to work, but I do think that Donald Rumsfeld changed travel plans multiple times when he was intending to come to Germany because of it. And for me, that's some small European victory in a sort of pool of epic defeats or whatever. But so I do. I think you're asking. I'm not sure if people were laughing because of the way you said it or because you think that it would never happen. But I think it's a perfectly reasonable thing for Europeans to say, we don't want to be involved with this, and if a war criminal is going to come into our territory and we believe we have evidence against them, of course you can go after them. In the US, we had a law that basically was just crushed recently that allowed people from around the world to sue corporations or dictators or generals in the United States. It was called the Alien Tort Claim Statute, and it was an incredible law that actually gave a sense of international justice to disempowered people around the globe, and it's gone now, and it was basically wiped out. But was it used against Pinochet? Yes, it was used against Pinochet. It was used against Rios Montt. It was used. I mean, there's multiple high-profile cases in the U.S., and it was one of the rare laws that could be used by true human rights activists to try to go after dictators and corporations that were violating human rights. So I totally support that. In general, in Europe, I think that what's happened with WikiLeaks and with Edward Snowden is, Glenn Greenwald, my colleague, is always talking about how courage is contagious. And I think that we're going to see other whistleblowers come forward because of this. And I think it would be interesting. I mean, I know that there has been some degree of whistleblowing in European governments, but I do think that it's a matter of time before this sort of spreads. And it requires dedicated journalists also to be working on these stories. But I don't have any illusions about sort of what we're up against, and I think that I think that people in the United States in general are very tired of the wars, and I think you saw that in a real way when Obama was proposing conducting strikes in Syria. But here in Europe, I think that ultimately it's about holding your own governments accountable also, including when they're complicit with the U.S. At Stuttgart, the military base here, it's not just that the US has this military presence inside of Germany. Stuttgart is one of the main facilities used by the Joint Special Operations Command, by JSOC. And they're using it as under the auspices of AFRICOM, the US Africa Command. But part of what they're doing at Stuttgart is plotting these operations in Africa. And this is, and so you have German soil, or from within Germany's borders rather, you have these operations being planned. That should be of great relevance to the debate in Germany over its ongoing role in US wars. The German government, though, let's be clear, definitely works with the NSA and the CIA and the US military and has a close relationship with the US government. That's for German society to debate what role you want your government to be playing in these. We have our hands full in America, so I mean, I think, and I'm sure you guys have your hands full here. On the issue of terrorism being a fact anymore, is it more today? Would Obama or his successor, what would it look like if they said, we're safe? No American politician will ever say that, for all sorts of reasons. And at the end of the day, I don't necessarily even think it's true. But what is safe, in a democratic society? I think that terrorism is a reality and is going to continue to be a reality for the rest of all of our lifetime. I'm very concerned about the issue of terrorism, but relative to other threats facing our societies, terrorism is small. More people die of bee stings in the United States every year than they do of terrorism on average. But we don't spend tens of billions of dollars trying to exterminate all of the bees. And it's although, yes, Monsanto maybe does want to kill all the bees, but they're not in power in the U.S. I think we've gone way overboard with our reaction, our overreaction to the issue of terrorism. I think that some of our policies are creating more potential for terrorism or incentive for terrorists. And at the end of the day, I believe that terrorism should be returned to being viewed as a crime, which I think is primarily the response of most European nations, that terrorism is viewed as a crime. But it's so deeply ingrained now in the political body of the United States that terrorism is something that we're at war with, whether President Obama tries to rebrand it or not, that mentality would be difficult to back off of, but never in a million years will U.S. politicians say we're safe. And I actually think we aren't ultimately safe at the end of the day. But is it a greater threat than climate change? Or any number of issues facing our societies. I think the issue is not whether terrorism is real or whether it's up or down on any given year, as much as it is how do democratic societies that claim to have a moral superiority to those that they're fighting, who want to blow up buses or airplanes, how do you deal with those individuals, whether they're your own citizens or not? And I think we have a very ineffective counterterrorism policy right now that buys into the idea that you can kill the bad guys and therefore stop the terrorism. Or abate it in a radical way. And I don't see that happening. I think we're going to pay for this sometime down the line. What happens when you hold a speech in the US? I don't give a different speech in Europe than I give in the US. I think I might be the only American citizen ever invited to give a speech at the Naval War College and a socialism conference. And I can assure you that I gave the same speech at the Naval War College that I gave at the socialism conference. Because I don't believe in pretending you're one thing or another, which is part of why I attack the idea of objective journalism as defined in journalism school. To one degree or another, all journalists engage in some form of advocacy or activism. I believe in being transparent about it, and people can decide whether they trust me or not, but I want people to know where I'm coming from. And I also do believe that we're not robots, I care about the people whose stories I write about, and I want justice for people that I think really got screwed in life. And I don't have any problem admitting that. I have a problem with people who don't admit that and then inject sort of propagandistic stuff into their pieces because it's part of a hidden agenda. Some of the most activist journalists in the US work for huge media outlets, and they're activists on behalf of the state. And they allow their media organizations to be used as conveyor belts to deliver propaganda. And so I think that to go into sort of what you're asking about, we have a totally bankrupt media culture in the US where there's 1,200 television channels and nothing on TV. You can know everything you want about rich white ladies in California and their poodles drinking Pinot Grigio, and you see nothing about the real widows of Baghdad, whose loved ones are killed in cafe bombings almost every day. And I think that we reached a sort of all-time low with the state of U.S. media in the build-up to the Iraq War. But there are a lot of exciting young journalists that are building independent media institutions, and I think that people are hungry for information. With the use of the internet comes all sorts of risks. The governments around the world can get all up in our business. When everything is in the cloud, they can access your cloud. But also hackers and other online activists are giving them a run for their money and forcing those in power to constantly be in a race to protect their own data security in the interest of violating everyone else's privacy. And so I think some of the most exciting activism and journalism right now is happening using the very tools that the state also exploits. And it's sort of it is a cyber war of sorts, but not in the conventional sense of nation states fighting each other. I think we as ordinary citizens are in a war against many governments to try to preserve our privacy and fight for justice. And I mean, that's why I believe in building independent media institutions. Finally, you said the thing about who are the paramilitary soldiers. I had a total misconception about the sort of who makes up, the elite forces of the Navy SEALs and Delta Force and others. A lot of the guys that I've met are extremely well educated. There's a U.S. Navy SEAL who's a neuroscientist. Admiral William McRaven was a trained journalist who wrote one of the definitive studies on the history of special operations warfare. You have guys that were in medical school that decided after 9/11 that they wanted to enlist in the Navy SEALs. Those units tend to not attract the wackos and the crazies, or the sort of psychopaths. It's a very unusual group of people, and I think that you do have truly sociopathic, psychopathic individuals in certain parts of the U.S. military. And I'm not saying that community, is absent those kinds of people, but you would be surprised. They would be very hard to recognize. They wouldn't stand out in a crowd. They're not beefed up steroid guys in those things. They tend to be wiry and look like they could be just a very fit business executive. And it's part of why they're able to blend in when they do what they do around the world. So I always tell people that they have to humanize the victims of American foreign policy in order to actually come to determination of whether they think it's right or wrong. But the same is true of these guys, and I learned something in the process of doing this book, and I think if you read it, you'll see that there are a lot of voices of dissent within that world that just don't often get discussed in the broader media coverage. So with that, I want to thank everyone for their time, and thank you here at the Einstein Institute, and thank you to Bernd as always, and your check is in the mail for your introduction. Thank you all.